This is something that's really been hidden a lot, but people have probably heard that, yes, Britain colonized India. Many of you know I just got back from India, and I've known a lot of this for many, many years, and I've talked about this, but I just wanted to highlight a couple things. One of the recent books that just came out is, people use the word Holocaust, I'm sure, to talk about, many people have heard what occurred in Germany. But what people do not know, and is unfortunately been hidden and really not talked about, is a Holocaust and the killing of up to 10 million people that just took place. And this is a conservative estimate in the state of Bengal after the East India Company took over, and we'll talk about that. And this was over 10 years. 10 million people were brutally killed and famine was perpetrated. And this came out in a book by Amrish Mishra, and he essentially argues very, very powerfully that he uses the word, quote unquote, untold holocaust, which caused the deaths of 10 million people over 10 years, beginning in 1857. Now, 1857, if you know a little bit of Indian history, is an important point. That's when the British went from being a trading force to becoming a occupying force. Okay, they went from being a trading force to becoming an occupying force. They initially came to trade, and I'll show you the dynamics of this. Now, the conventional histories were, oh, don't worry, only about 100,000 Indian soldiers died. But the reality is that the brutality of the British Empire, the royalty, which still profits from it today, they haven't given back their money from this profit. Just in Bengal alone, about 10 million people were brutalized. And you'll see pictures like this of starving people in India. When I came to the United States in the 70s, we'd see these pictures, and then you'd have celebrities saying, oh, please feed these people. They're not getting enough food. But what people don't tell you, this is 1945. This is before, quote unquote, Indian independence. And what you'll realize is between 12 to 29 million people across India died of starvation during control of the British Empire. In 1943, up to 4 million Bengalis. Bengal is on the east coast of India, starved to death. And this is just one example when Winston Churchill diverted food to British soldiers in countries such as Greece, while a deadly famine swept Bengal. Because essentially what the British did was, remember, Britain really didn't have any resources. They did have the resource of brutality, but they didn't really have any fundamental resources. So when they went to China, they said, oh, we want to come here and trade. And China said, what do you have to trade with us? You got nothing. When they came to India, Britain really didn't have anything to trade, but they did recognize that they could be fiercely brutal. And they raped India not only of jewels and textiles, but just food. Remember, India had 3 crop seasons. Britain at best had 1. So the amount of food that India produced was quite immense. People forget India was an extremely wealthy nation, and we'll talk more about this. So Britain brutalized India. And these are just not to hype up anything. These are just facts. But a lot of that wealth was taken at the expense of Indians. And this is really not talked about by any historians, particularly the liberal elite. Historians in the United States and Britain will not talk about this. They'll talk about a lot of other things, but they'll miss these very, very important facts. In fact, Winston Churchill said, I hate Indians. They're beastly people with a beastly religion. And that's what he said. To those of you who are in America, we can't forget that Britain was pretty brutal to the American colonists. The difference between, I would argue, between the British and what occurred in India and in America was a little bit different, because India was fundamentally run by many, many kingdoms. There was really no India. India was many, many feudal kingdoms. So it's easily to isolate India, divide up people. In the United States, because it was a little more a newer country, there was at least 13 colonies that united. But, Britain was brutal here too. Everyone remembers the Boston Massacre. You can read about it. Very important point. The tensions ran very high in Boston in the early 1770, and 2,000 British soldiers occupied a city of 16,000 colonists. And Britain, as it went everywhere, imposed taxes. Those taxes were like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the American colonists rebelled against these taxes. This is where the cry taxation with that representation came. This resulted in people fighting, and the real start of the Revolutionary War was the Boston Massacre, which was a deadly riot on March 5th, 1770. Colonists were attempted to fight back, and it escalated into a bloody slaughter that really was the birth of the American Revolution. But it's not only in America such massacres took place. Britain had a history of doing this pretty much everywhere they went. There's a wonderful PhD thesis that came out about a little more than a decade ago. It says the empire of violence, strategies of British rule in India and Ireland in the aftermath of the Great War. And some of you may know, if you're of the Amritsar massacre, which occurred on April 13th, 1919. The Indian people were having a peaceful gathering in a park, Jallianwala Bagh, in a city park. And it's actually in the movie Gandhi, if you've seen it. I don't care much for Gandhi, as some of you may know, for lots of reasons. But anyway, in that movie, they show this scene where people are gathering in Amritsar, which is one of the holiest cities of the Sikh religion, and the British Gurkha troops just mow down 379 unarmed demonstrators. It's quite, if you see it, it'll bring tears to your eyes. And most of those who were killed were Indian nationalists who were meeting to protest the British government's forced conscription of Indian soldiers. Remember, the British really, again, had very little resource, including soldiers. They would actually force the conscription of Indian soldiers to fight in their war, in their subjugation of the Indian people. Okay? You can find pictures of this, but essentially people were in this park and literally they were just mowed down, unarmed people. Okay? Just pure brutality. Another one, if you're of Irish descent, you may know is Bloody Sunday. And, every year it's celebrated. This is in 2022, celebrated, remembered. And this is when 14 civil rights marchers were killed by British soldiers in one of the defining days of the North Ireland conflict. And that occurred about 50 years ago. And you can see the infamous killings of those 14 civil rights marchers were done by elite parachute regiment in January 30th of 1972. So I'm sharing these dates with you because you can go back to 1770, you can go back to the 1800s, and you can go back to the 1900s. It's constant just brutality. Sorry to say that. And I'm not talking about the British hardworking people. We're talking about the British elites who unleash this brutality. And yet we continue to honor this and we celebrate this royalty, and you have people celebrating this queen who still profits from it. And I just don't understand it. I don't understand the psychology. Now, years after in Ireland, after pressure from the victims' families, the 12-year Bloody Sunday inquiry took 12 years to do this inquiry, also known as the Savile inquiry, later found that the victims had not posed a threat to the soldiers. That's what's important. And what also came out was that finally, Prime Minister David Cameron issued an official apology for the killings on behalf of his government, confirming that those killed were innocent victims. Okay. So again, it was so clear that what occurred in Ireland was unjust, what occurred in Amritsar was unjust, and so on. What I want to now take a step back to really understand, follow the money, the economy of it. The narrative that a typical Indian is brought up when you're young, or many of the Indian elites are brought up, is, oh, Britain did so much for India. We should be so happy. They civilized these darkies. They civilized the Africans. They did so much for the American colonists, right? That's typically what's brought up. Even the Indian historians who are British trained, most of them, will never really go down to the economics and really understand what really took place, the amount of wealth transfer that took place. The narrative is you just see a bunch of poor Indians starving, and these people are just poor people and they have nothing, and the white man liberated them. It's really not true. You have to ask your question, why did Columbus want to go to India? Why did everyone want to go to India? Because India was producing 25% at the time, the wealth of the world. 25% of the wealth of the world was from India, because just from a geographical perspective, you have the northern countries, which can have crops, as Utsa Patnaik explains in her analysis, maybe one growing season. Well, in the south, you could have up to 3 growing seasons. So you had places like India, which were growing cotton and all sorts of incredible resources, very, very resource rich. The United Kingdom was not resource rich. They had really nothing to trade. Utsa Patnaik's analysis, which just came out, she was an economist. She said that she actually went and did an analysis by looking at British records to really put a number, how much money was stolen from India when you really add up the wealth that was taken. And we're going to see this, and you're going to see how clever the British elites actually were. The analysis that she reveals was 45 trillion from India was taken. Now that's, if you look at the British GDP, that's, I think British GDP is maybe 1 trillion. So it's 45 times more than the entire wealth of Britain even today. And to understand how this happened, I'm just reading some excerpts, because a common story that she argues that we're told is that, the empire was sustained for long, it was a gesture of British benevolence. But the new research that she shows, and she's calculated between 1765 and 1938, Britain essentially drained a total of $45 trillion. 45 trillion. So let's really understand how this happened. And by the way, to correct any false narratives, India used to be called the golden bird, which was fairly accurate, as this writer says, because at the time, India accounted for approximately 25% of global net wealth. 25%. So if you think about the world economies today is around 600 trillion. So if you take 25% of that, that's about 150 trillion in modern terms if India had sustained that. But at that time, 25% of the net global wealth. And India transitioned from a prosperous nation nation to becoming a poor, quote unquote, developing nation, third world nation, impoverished until the end of 1947. So basically, India was completely looted. So how did this occur? I can't overemphasize to everyone, you have to take the Foundations of Systems course. I encourage all of you to become warrior scholars, because when you take the course, by the way, you can get the book, and let me just show it up in case you don't see the link. If you go to vashiva.join, we've made it extremely accessible to anyone, but you will realize that everything we do, whether I look at a molecular system or a historical system, I start looking at interconnections. And what I did was, from Utsa Patnaik's work, I started actually doing a diagram, because, I mean, she's a great intellect, but it's sometimes hard to follow this. What I did was put it into a diagram. So let me explain this. So what you see here is that pre-1764, okay, remember, to give you a little bit of Indian history, world history, 1457 is when Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, comes to India, and then people start coming into India. People came to India initially to trade. In the 1600s, there was an emergence of entrepreneurs and traders coming up in India in all these different kingdoms. So the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the French came, the Portuguese came. Portuguese, Dutch, French, the British came to trade with these emerging merchants all over India, because India had so much natural resources, right? Textiles, spices, gold. India was a manufacturing powerhouse. Seriously, a manufacturing powerhouse. They knew how to make stainless steel. Someone just said spices. Exactly.